I'm Lieutenant Col Ariana Hale, 39, and I built my career from long nights, hard missions, and a few too many evacuation flights that ended with medals I never asked for. For years, I backed someone I thought deserved my loyalty, gave him results, credit, and silence. But the day he mocked me in a joint briefing, in front of his entire staff, I made a decision that shifted everything. Ever been dismissed or humiliated by someone you carried farther than they ever carried you? If you have, share your story in the comments. You're not the only one who's been there. Before I dive into what really happened, tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand your ground after being written off, hit like and subscribe for more stories about drawing the line and taking your power back. What came next surprised even me. I grew up on Air Force bases where the sound of turbines meant home. My mother was an E-7 aircrew chief who could strip an engine faster than most people could change a tire, and my father was a civilian contractor who taught me that military service was about competence, not ceremony. By the time I was 16, I joined the Civil Air Patrol and tasted my first rescue mission, a lost hiker in the Cascades who'd broken his ankle 3 miles from the trailhead. We found him at dawn, hypothermic but alive, and I remember thinking that this was what purpose felt like. I commissioned at 22 through ROTC, a freshly minted second lieutenant with the kind of idealism that boot polish and pressed uniforms can't quite capture. My first deployment attached me to a joint Special Operations Aviation Support Cell in Djibouti, where the heat could melt your resolve and the mission tempo taught you to sleep in 5-minute intervals. That's where I met then Lieutenant Commander Cole Maddox, a Navy SEAL officer with 15 years in service and a reputation that preceded him like a weather front. He was 04 to my 01, which meant he was God and I was barely trusted to hold a clipboard. But he noticed my work. When I coordinated a nighttime extraction that saved 3 Army Rangers from a compromised position, he pulled me aside afterward and said, "Good instincts, Lieutenant. Keep that up." It felt like a benediction. I was 23 years old and hungry to prove I belonged in rooms where decisions were made in seconds and lives hung in the balance. The relationship that developed was mentorship from a distance. He'd offer advice during joint planning sessions, tell me which schools to apply for, which assignments would build my record. When I earned my first Purple Heart after a rescue helo took small arms fire over Mogadishu and shrapnel peppered my left shoulder, he was the one who told me that pain was just proof I'd been in the fight. The wound earned me a 3-week recovery and a citation that went into my personnel file. What I didn't know until later was that he'd used my after-action report, my detailed breakdown of the mission's tactical failures, to brief his own chain of command. He presented my analysis as collaborative insight. His evaluation report that cycle called him an exceptional tactical mind with keen operational awareness. I told myself it didn't matter. The mission was what counted. Results were what counted. I made first lieutenant at 24, captain at 27, and every step felt earned through blood, sweat, and the kind of competence that turns chaos into coordinated action. I deployed to Afghanistan twice, Iraq once, and spent 9 months in the Pacific Theater coordinating combat search and rescue operations that brought home pilots who'd ejected over hostile territory. My second Purple Heart came during a mass casualty evacuation outside Kandahar. An IED detonated near our landing zone while we were loading wounded Marines onto the bird. The blast wave threw me into the helo's bulkhead hard enough to crack 2 ribs and give me a concussion that left me seeing double for a week. I stayed on the bird. We got everyone out. Commander Maddox, he'd made 05 by then, sent me a message that read, "Heard about Kandahar. You've got grit, kid. Don't waste it getting yourself killed. Kid." I was 29 years old, a captain with 2 combat deployments and a growing record of successful high-risk operations. But to him, I was still the junior officer who'd once needed his guidance. The thing about mentorship is that it creates a debt you can never quite repay. He'd opened doors. He'd vouched for me. And in return, I gave him loyalty, diligence, and results he could leverage. It was transactional in a way I didn't want to examine too closely. By the time I made Major at 32, he'd been selected for Captain 06 in Navy terms, the equivalent of my new rank's big brother. He was being groomed for flag rank, the kind of officer who'd end up with stars and a corner office at the Pentagon. We still crossed paths at joint conferences and planning cells, but the dynamic had shifted. He'd stopped returning my emails about training coordination issues. When I'd flag a potential problem in inter-service communication protocols, he'd acknowledge it with a two-word reply, noted. Thanks. At a joint planning conference in Stuttgart, he introduced me to a room full of senior officers as one of the bright young ones we're developing. I was 34 years old. I outranked half the people in that room. But he said it with a smile that made disagreement seem churlish, and I watched the other officers' eyes slide past me like I was an intern fetching coffee. His staff officers began mirroring his tone. During a logistics brief, a Navy lieutenant commander referred to me as Junior Air Force Support, despite the fact that I held operational authority for the entire theater's combat search and rescue architecture. I corrected him once. He apologized. Then he did it again the next week. My third Purple Heart came during a nighttime combat controller extraction in Helmand Province. We took fire on approach and the pilot had to abort the landing twice. On the third attempt, a round punched through the cabin and caught me in the right thigh, shattering my femur. I stayed conscious long enough to coordinate the extraction of the team on the ground, then passed out from blood loss somewhere over Pakistani airspace. I woke up in Landstuhl with titanium pins in my leg and a surgeon telling me I'd be walking with a limp for the rest of my life. Captain Maddox, soon to be Rear Admiral Maddox, sent flowers to my hospital room with a card that read, "She gets herself hurt because she pushes too hard." I found out later he'd said it to colleagues at a briefing. Not with concern. With exasperation. As if my injuries were a character flaw rather than the cost of doing the job. I spent 6 months in physical therapy relearning how to run. The limp faded to almost nothing, but I felt it every morning when I laced up my boots. By the time I returned to full duty, Maddox had his first star. Rear Admiral, lower half. Oh, 7. He'd made it. And around him had grown a circle of younger SEAL officers who treated him like a prophet and everyone else like obstacles. They rewrote history in small ways. Missions I'd coordinated became missions he'd overseen. Successes I'd engineered became successes he'd enabled. During a logistics coordination meeting in Tampa, I recommended a change to our aerial refueling protocols that would cut response time by 15 minutes. He dismissed it publicly, saying we'd stay with established procedures. Then he texted me privately, "Run ideas by me before you bring them to the table. Makes things smoother." I stared at that text for a long time. The translation was clear. Don't embarrass me by being competent in front of people I need to impress. I didn't respond. I saved the message. And I started to understand that I was no longer useful to him for career advancement. I'd become a reminder of obligations he'd rather forget. So he treated me the way people treat things they've outgrown, with dismissive affection and the presumption that I should be grateful for the attention. I was 37 years old, a major with 3 Purple Hearts and a record that spoke for itself. But in his eyes, I'd always be the rookie who'd once needed his help. And that's the thing about one-directional bonds. Eventually, the person giving everything realizes they've been funding someone else's legacy with their own blood. I made lieutenant colonel at 38. The promotion felt like vindication. 05 meant real authority, strategic influence, the kind of rank where your name carried weight in joint operations planning. I'd earned it through deployments that aged me faster than calendars could track and decisions that left scars deeper than the ones on my shoulder and thigh. When the notification came through, I allowed myself one night of quiet celebration with a glass of bourbon and the knowledge that I'd clawed my way to this moment without compromising who I was. The assignment came 2 weeks later, Joint Mission Planning Cell for a high-risk maritime interdiction operation in the South China Sea. Multi-service coordination, special operations integration, the kind of mission where failure meant international incidents and success meant nobody ever heard about it. The command authority was Vice Admiral Cole Maddox, 08, 2 stars and a corner office that overlooked the water at Naval Station Norfolk. I hadn't worked directly under him in 3 years. The news settled in my stomach like a stone. I flew into Norfolk on a Tuesday and spent the evening reviewing the operational brief. The mission was complex, coordinated strikes against a piracy network that had been disrupting commercial shipping lanes, with SEAL teams, Marine Force Recon, and Air Force combat controllers all operating in concert. My role was to coordinate the aviation support architecture, helos, fixed-wing assets, aerial refueling, and emergency extraction protocols. It was the kind of assignment that could make or break a career. The first full briefing was scheduled for 0800 hours on Thursday. I arrived 15 minutes early wearing service dress, ribbons aligned, documentation organized in a leather portfolio that had survived 4 deployments. The conference room was already half full, Navy officers in their whites, a Marine colonel in dress blues, 2 Army majors comparing notes near the coffee station. I took a seat midway down the table, opened my portfolio, and waited. Admiral Maddox entered at 0758, exactly 2 minutes early, the way he always did. He commanded attention without effort, tall, trim, graying at the temples in a way that made him look distinguished rather than old. His ribbons told a story of 3 decades in combat zones, and his SEAL trident gleamed like a promise. The room quieted. Officers straightened in their chairs. His eyes swept the table, cataloging faces, assessing confidence. When his gaze landed on me, something flickered in his expression, surprise, maybe, or irritation. Then his mouth curved into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Who let the rookie in?" The words cut through the room like a blade. Laughter erupted from his staff officers, 3 Navy lieutenant commanders clustered near his end of the table, younger guys who'd probably never deployed outside of training rotations, but wore their SEAL tridents like crowns. One of them actually slapped the table. I kept my face neutral. Didn't blink. Didn't move. This was a test, I told myself. A joke. A moment of thoughtless humor from a senior officer who'd forgotten I'd aged past the version of me he'd once known. But Maddox wasn't done. "Someone get her a notepad," he said, still smiling. "So she can keep up." More laughter. The Marine colonel shot me a look that held something between sympathy and secondhand embarrassment. One of the Army majors studied his coffee like it contained answers to questions he didn't want to ask. The room felt hot suddenly. My pulse was steady. Years of combat had taught me to control physiological responses to stress, but something deeper was happening. This wasn't a joke. This was calculated. This was him establishing hierarchy in front of his people, reminding everyone that no matter what rank I wore, I was still the junior officer who'd once taken his guidance. I was still someone he could dismiss. I placed my portfolio on the table. Opened it slowly, deliberately. My hands were steady. Inside was the operational brief I'd prepared, supply chain analyses, contingency protocols. And something else. I reached into my jacket. The room was still laughing, the sound sharp and ugly in a way that made my teeth ache. I set the first Purple Heart on the table. The metal gleamed under the fluorescent lights, bronze heart-shaped, with Washington's profile in the center. The purple ribbon pooled beneath it. The laughter faltered. I set down the second Purple Heart. Then the third. Then the fourth. 4 purple hearts arranged in a line on the polished wood table, each one representing blood spilled, bones broken, months of recovery and rehabilitation. Each one a testament to missions where I'd stayed conscious through pain that should have rendered me unconscious, where I'd kept coordinating extractions while my own body was failing. The silence was absolute. I looked directly at Admiral Maddox. His face had drained of color, the smile gone, replaced by something that looked like shock or maybe comprehension. Every eye in the room was on me now, but I only cared about his. When I spoke, my voice was quiet, controlled, professional. "With respect, Admiral, which one of us is the rookie now, sir?" The words hung in the air. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The lieutenant commanders who'd been laughing 30 seconds ago looked like they wanted to dissolve into their chairs. The Marine colonel's expression had shifted to something that might have been approval. Maddox opened his mouth. Closed it. His jaw worked like he was trying to find words that wouldn't come. He'd built a career on projecting confidence, on making split-second decisions in crisis, but right now he looked like a man who'd just realized he'd miscalculated badly. I gathered the Purple Hearts carefully, deliberately, and placed them back in my jacket. Then I opened my operational brief and set it on the table. "Shall we begin, sir?" I said. The briefing lasted 2 hours. Admiral Maddox recovered enough to run through the mission overview, but his rhythm was off. He stumbled over transition points, deferred to his staff more than usual, and avoided making eye contact with me. I presented my aviation support architecture analysis at the 90-minute mark, outlining response timelines, asset allocation, and contingency protocols for 3 different failure scenarios. Nobody interrupted me. When I finished, the Marine colonel, I'd learn later his name was Elias Porter, 06, 28 years in service, nodded and said, "That's solid work, Colonel Hale." Colonel Hale. Not Lieutenant Colonel. Not junior support. My rank, spoken with the weight it deserved. When the briefing ended, officers filed out in clusters, voices low, careful. I stayed in my seat, organizing my notes, letting the room empty. I wasn't hiding. I just needed a moment to process what had happened, to let the adrenaline cycle out of my system before I tried to walk anywhere. Colonel Hale. I looked up. Colonel Porter stood by the door, waiting. He was maybe 50, with the kind of weathered face that came from decades in the Corps and eyes that had seen enough to stop being surprised by human behavior. "Sir," I said, standing. He glanced down the hallway where the last of the Navy officers were disappearing around a corner, then stepped back into the room and closed the door. "You handled that with more discipline than he deserved," Porter said quietly. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded. "I've worked with Maddox before," he continued. "Brilliant tactician. Hell of a SEAL. But he's got a habit of taking credit for other people's competence and then resenting them when they don't stay grateful." He paused. "How long have you known him?" 16 years, sir. Since I was a second lieutenant." Porter's expression shifted, understanding, maybe, or recognition. "That's a long time to carry someone else's career on your back." The words hit harder than I expected. I'd never articulated it that way, never let myself think of it in such stark terms. But hearing it spoken aloud by someone who had no stake in protecting either of us made it real. "I'm not looking for revenge, sir," I said. "I just want to do my job." "I know," Porter said. "That's why what you did in there mattered. You didn't attack him. You just reminded everyone, including him, who you actually are." He moved toward the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, I'll be recommending you lead the aviation coordination brief for the Joint Chiefs Review next month. You've earned it." He left before I could respond. I gathered my materials and walked back to my quarters, a small room in the visiting officers' quarters that smelled like industrial cleaner and old coffee. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall for a long time, not thinking, just breathing. My leg ached where the old shrapnel wound had scarred, a phantom pain that flared when I was stressed. I rubbed it absently. There was a knock on the door at 1800 hours. I opened it to find Chief Master Sergeant Marcus Red standing in the hallway, a duffel slung over his shoulder, and expression that suggested he already knew why he was here. Marcus was E9, 46 years old, 28 years in the Air Force, and the closest thing I had to a best friend in the service. We deployed together twice, and he had a talent for showing up exactly when I needed someone who wouldn't bullshit me. "Heard you had an interesting morning," he said. I stepped aside and let him in. He dropped his duffel, pulled 2 beers from his jacket pockets, contraband in the view queue, but neither of us cared, and handed me one. "Talk to me," he said. So I did. I told him about the briefing, about Maddox's comment, about the 4 purple hearts on the table. I told him about 16 years of one-directional mentorship, about after-action reports I'd written that became his talking points, about missions I'd coordinated that became his legacy. I told him about being called kid when I was 34, about being introduced as one of the bright young ones when I outranked half the room. Marcus listened without interrupting, the way good senior NCOs do. When I finished, he took a long pull from his beer and said, "You know what you just described?" "What?" "Parasitism." He set the bottle down. "He's been feeding off you for 16 years. Taking your competence, your results, your blood, and using it to build his own reputation. And the moment you became too senior to keep playing that role, he tried to cut you back down to size." I wanted to argue, to say it wasn't that simple, that there had been genuine mentorship in the early years. But sitting in that small room with the fluorescent lights humming overhead, I couldn't find the words to defend him. "What do I do?" I asked. Marcus met my eyes. "You already did it. You set the boundary. Now you hold the line." We finished the beers in silence. After he left, I pulled out my jacket and looked at the 4 purple hearts. The first one, from Mogadishu. I'd been 23, terrified, convinced I was going to die in a helicopter over a city I'd barely heard of before deploying. The second, from Kandahar, 29, more experienced, but still shocked by how much an IED blast could compress time into a single moment of white-hot chaos. The third, from Helmand, 34, professional enough to stay focused even as my femur shattered and blood soaked through my flight suit. The fourth I'd earned 6 months ago, during a classified operation I still couldn't talk about. It involved a downed pilot, a firefight that lasted 11 minutes, and a decision I'd made that saved 3 lives and nearly cost me my own. For Purple Hearts. For times I'd bled for the mission. For times I'd proven I belonged in the rooms where decisions were made. And Admiral Cole Maddox had looked at me and seen a rookie. I placed the medals back in their case and locked it. Then I sat down at the small desk and began drafting a memorandum for the record. Not because I wanted revenge. Not because I was angry. But because what had happened in that briefing room was conduct unbecoming, and accuracy mattered more than politics. I wrote it clinically, professionally, without emotion. I documented the date, time, location, witnesses present, and exact words spoken. I noted that the Admiral's comments had occurred in front of 15 officers from 4 service branches, and that the remarks had been directed at a lieutenant colonel with 16 years of service and 4 Purple Hearts. I did not editorialize. I did not interpret. I simply reported the facts. When I finished, I read it 3 times, checking for any trace of personal grievance. There was none. It was a statement of what had happened, nothing more. I sent it through my Air Force chain of command with a copy to the Joint Task Force Inspector General Liaison. Then I closed my laptop and went to bed. I didn't sleep well, but I slept. Word spread faster than I expected. By the next morning, 3 separate Air Force officers had pulled me aside to ask if I was okay. By afternoon, a Navy captain I'd never met stopped me in the hallway and said, "I heard about the briefing." For what it's worth, Maddox was out of line. The message I'd been half expecting came at 16:30 hours, a meeting request from Rear Admiral Maddox's office. Not an order. A request. The distinction mattered. I confirmed for 0900 the next day. That evening, a different message arrived, this one from a Navy commander I vaguely recognized from the briefing. It read, "Ma'am, several senior Navy officers are concerned about the memorandum you filed. They've asked me to reach out and see if there's a way to resolve this informally. The Admiral is willing to apologize privately and move forward. Going through official channels could damage both your careers." I read it twice. Then I deleted it. The meeting with Admiral Maddox took place in a small conference room adjacent to his office. No staff. No witnesses. Just the 2 of us and 16 years of history sitting between us like a third presence. He looked tired. The confidence he usually wore like armor had cracks in it, visible in the way he held his shoulders, the tightness around his eyes. "Ariana," he said, using my first name for the first time in years. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." I sat across from him, hands folded on the table. "Sir, what I said in the briefing, it was a joke. Poor judgment, maybe, but not malicious. You know how these things go. Room full of alpha types, everyone trying to establish rapport." He leaned forward slightly. "I never meant to disrespect you. You have to know that." I let the silence stretch. He shifted in his chair. "I've been hearing you filed a formal memorandum," he continued. "That seems disproportionate. We've known each other a long time. I've supported your career. I thought we had a better relationship than this." There it was. The guilt trip. The reminder of obligations. The suggestion that my response was ungrateful, excessive, a betrayal of the bond he believed existed between us. I kept my voice level. "Sir, the memorandum documents what happened. Nothing more. I reported the truth." "The truth can be interpreted different ways," he said, and there was an edge in his voice now. You made me look bad in front of my staff. You embarrassed me. You called me a rookie in front of 15 officers, I said quietly. I'm a lieutenant colonel with 4 Purple Hearts and 16 years of service. Which part of that was I supposed to interpret as a joke? He sat back, jaw tight. So, this is about revenge. No, sir. This is about establishing that my rank and record deserve respect. Not because I used to be your junior officer. Not because you once offered me guidance. But because I earned them. By throwing your medals on a table? By serving with distinction for 16 years while you took credit for my work and then dismissed me the moment I became too senior to be useful. The words came out sharper than I'd intended, but I didn't regret them. His face flushed. That's not fair, he said. Isn't it? I opened my portfolio and pulled out a printed email, one he'd sent me 4 years ago, telling me to run my ideas by him before bringing them to the table. You've been managing my visibility for years, sir. Making sure I stayed just junior enough to reflect well on you without threatening your position. And the moment that dynamic shifted, you tried to put me back in my place. He stared at the email. When he looked up, something had changed in his expression, not quite acknowledgement, but close. What do you want from me? He asked. Nothing, sir. I want to do my job. I want to be treated as the officer I am, not the lieutenant I was. And I want you to understand that I'm not withdrawing the memorandum. You're making a mistake, he said, and now his voice carried a warning. Going after an admiral is career suicide. You'll regret this. I stood. With respect, sir, the only thing I regret is not doing it sooner. I left before he could respond. Over the next week, the consequences began to unfold in ways both subtle and overt. 2 Navy captains approached me separately, suggesting I reconsider my position for the sake of inter-service cooperation. An Air Force colonel I'd never met called to say he'd heard about the situation and wanted me to know that making waves rarely ended well for junior officers. Apparently, in his mind, 05 still counted as junior. I declined every suggestion to withdraw the statement. The Inspector General's office opened a preliminary inquiry. Not a full investigation, not yet, but enough to put Admiral Maddox's conduct under review. I gave my statement to a Navy commander who listened without expression, took notes, and thanked me for my cooperation. The next briefing was different. Maddox was careful, professional, distant. He didn't make jokes. He didn't dismiss anyone's input. And when I presented my updated aviation support analysis, he acknowledged it with a simple, "Thank you, Colonel Hale. We'll incorporate those changes." It was the bare minimum. But it was also the first time in years he'd treated me like an equal. After the briefing, one of the Navy lieutenant commanders who'd laughed during the original incident approached me near the coffee station. He looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I wanted to apologize. For the other day. That wasn't." I shouldn't have laughed. I studied him. He was maybe 28, 04, probably thought Maddox walked on water and wanted to impress him. He'd been thoughtless, not malicious. "Apology accepted, Lieutenant Commander," I said. He nodded and left quickly. That evening, Chief Red and I grabbed dinner at a diner off base, the kind of place where the coffee was bad and the burgers were honest. "You know you've shifted the entire power dynamic in that planning cell," Marcus said around a mouthful of fries. "How so?" "Maddox is scared of you now. He doesn't know what you're going to do next, and that makes him cautious. Cautious people make mistakes." He paused. "You're not trying to destroy him, are you?" "No," I said. "I'm just trying to make sure he can't destroy me." Marcus nodded. "That's the right answer." I poked at my burger. "Do you think I'm making a mistake? Going on record like this?" "Honestly?" He set down his beer. "I think you're doing what most people don't have the guts to do. You're holding someone accountable who's used to being untouchable. That's always going to cost you something. The question is whether what you're fighting for is worth the price." I thought about that. About 16 years of swallowing disrespect. About missions I'd led that became his accomplishments. About being called a rookie in front of people who should have known better. "It's worth it," I said. "Then you're going to be fine." We finished dinner and drove back to base in comfortable silence. When I got to my quarters, there was a message waiting. Colonel Porter wanted to see me at 0800 tomorrow. I showed up on time. Porter's office was utilitarian, Marine Corps flags, commendation plaques, a photo of him shaking hands with a past commandant. He gestured me to a chair. "I'm leading the brief to the Joint Chiefs next month," he said without preamble. "I want you as my primary aviation warfare advisor. You'll present directly to the chiefs." Interested? It was the kind of assignment that could define a career. High visibility, high stakes, direct access to the highest levels of military leadership. "Yes, sir," I said. "Good." He leaned back. "Maddox won't like it. He'll probably try to block it. But he doesn't have the authority, and frankly, after what happened, he's not in a position to make demands. You've earned this." I left his office feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks, vindicated. Not because Maddox was being sidelined, but because someone with actual authority had recognized that competence mattered more than politics. The line I'd drawn was holding. And for the first time in years, I wasn't the one bending. The planning cell evolved over the following weeks in ways both visible and subtle. Admiral Maddox remained professionally distant, his interactions with me limited to mission-essential communication. He no longer made casual remarks about my experience or lack thereof. He no longer dismissed my recommendations. He simply existed in the same operational space, careful not to cross any lines that might trigger another memorandum. But the real shift happened with everyone else. The Marine and Army officers who'd witnessed the Purple Hearts moment treated me differently now, not with pity or awkwardness, but with a kind of professional respect that felt earned rather than obligatory. When I walked into briefings, people stood. When I offered recommendations, they were implemented without debate. It wasn't about rank inflation or special treatment. It was about the recognition that I'd proven myself in ways that couldn't be dismissed or minimized. Colonel Porter assigned me to lead the aviation warfare section of the Joint Chiefs Brief, which meant I spent 3 weeks developing a comprehensive analysis of close air support integration, helicopter assault coordination, and emergency extraction protocols for high-risk maritime environments. The work was demanding, 18-hour days, endless scenario modeling, coordination with assets across 4 service branches. But it was also exactly the kind of challenge I'd trained for. Lieutenant Commander Brett Kincaid, one of the Navy officers who'd laughed during the initial briefing, started showing up at my workspace around 2000 hours with questions about inter-service communication protocols. The first time, I was suspicious. The third time, I realized he was genuinely trying to learn. "Why are you asking me?" I said one evening, looking up from a logistics spreadsheet. He hesitated, then said, "Because you're better at this than anyone else in the cell. And I've spent too much time assuming SEAL teams could handle everything independently." He paused. That was stupid. I studied him. He looked tired, humbled in a way that seemed authentic. "You want to know the real secret to joint operations?" "Yes, ma'am." Nobody's the hero. Everybody's support. The moment you understand that the guy on the ground is only as good as the pilot in the air, who's only as good as the maintainer on the deck, who's only as good as the logistician tracking parts, that's when you stop being a liability. He nodded slowly. "The Admiral doesn't think like that." "I know." Kincaid left, but he came back the next night with better questions. By the end of the week, he was integrating my recommendations into the SEAL team's insertion planning. Small victories, but they added up. The real test came during a full-scale mission rehearsal 3 weeks before the Joint Chiefs Brief. We ran a simulated assault on a pirate stronghold using live assets, helicopters, patrol boats, a destroyer providing offshore fire support. My role was to coordinate the aviation piece, insertion timing, extraction windows, emergency divert protocols if weather turned or enemy fire intensified. Admiral Maddox ran the operation from the command center, his voice calm and measured over the radio net. For 2 hours, everything functioned exactly as planned. Then the scenario controllers threw a curveball, simulated mechanical failure on the primary extraction helo, forcing us to redirect to a backup bird that was 12 minutes out and low on fuel. I made the call in real time, reroute the backup helo to a forward refueling point, delay extraction by 8 minutes, reposition the ground team to a secondary landing zone with better cover. It required split-second coordination with the Marine ground commander, the Navy destroyer captain, and the Air Force tanker crew. But it worked. The simulated extraction succeeded with 0 casualties and acceptable mission delay. When the exercise ended, Maddox called the debrief. 50 officers packed into the operations center, reviewing timelines and decision points. When we reached the mechanical failure sequence, he paused the playback. The aviation coordination during the emergency phase was textbook, he said, looking at the screen rather than at me. Colonel Hale's decision to reroute and delay was the right call. It saved the mission. It wasn't effusive praise. It wasn't personal. But it was public acknowledgement from a 2-star admiral that I'd done my job well. In the silence that followed, I realized that this was as close to an apology as he was capable of giving recognition, delivered in front of the same people who'd heard him call me a rookie. After the debrief, several officers congratulated me. Colonel Porter clapped me on the shoulder and said, "That's going in my Joint Chiefs presentation. Good work." I went back to my quarters and sat in the dark for a while, processing. The dynamic had shifted so completely from where it had started that I almost didn't recognize the operational environment anymore. Maddox was still the commander, but I was no longer the junior officer absorbing his reflected authority. I was the subject matter expert whose decisions determined mission success. Chief Red knocked on my door around 2200 hours. I let him in, and he handed me a beer. "Heard about the rehearsal," he said. "You're becoming the de facto aviation authority in that cell." Maddox is still in command. Sure, but command and authority aren't the same thing. He's got the rank. You've got the expertise. And right now, everyone in that cell knows which one matters more. Marcus took a drink. How does that feel? I thought about it. Complicated. I didn't want to take anything from him. I just wanted him to stop taking from me. "That's the difference between revenge and accountability," Marcus said. Revenge is about tearing someone down. Accountability is about making sure they can't tear you down. You chose accountability. He's being careful now. Professional. Distant. Because he knows you're not afraid of him anymore. And men like Maddox, men who've built their authority on other people's fear, they don't know how to operate when that fear disappears. We sat in silence for a while. Finally, Marcus said, "You know you've changed, right?" "How?" "You carry yourself different. Like you finally believe you've earned the rank you're wearing." He paused. "It's good to see." After he left, I pulled out my uniform for the next day and checked the ribbons. 3 rows of decorations, each one representing something I'd done, somewhere I'd been, some moment where I'd chosen mission over self-preservation. At the top, above everything else, sat the ribbon for my 4th Purple Heart. I'd spent 16 years trying to prove I belonged in rooms with men like Cole Maddox. I'd bled for that belonging. I'd broken bones for it. I'd survived explosions and gunfire and the grinding attrition of deployments that aged you in ways calendars couldn't measure. And somewhere along the way, I'd forgotten that I didn't need his validation. I'd already earned everything I had. The next morning, I walked into the operations center at 0700. Admiral Maddox was already there, reviewing overnight intelligence reports. When I entered, he looked up. "Colonel Hale," he said. "A greeting, nothing more." "Admiral," I replied. We worked in parallel for the next 3 hours, coordinating different aspects of the mission planning. He asked for my input twice. I provided it. He implemented it without argument. It was professional, efficient, and completely devoid of the mentor-protege dynamic that had defined our relationship for 16 years. At some point, I realized I preferred it this way. The distance was clean. The boundaries were clear. There was no debt, no obligation, no unspoken expectation that I owed him anything beyond professional competence. I didn't need him to be my mentor anymore. I needed him to be my commander, nothing more, nothing less. And finally, that's exactly what he was. The Joint Chiefs brief was scheduled for 0900 on a Tuesday in early October. Colonel Porter and I flew to Washington 3 days early to finalize the presentation and coordinate with the J-3 staff. The Pentagon felt different from field operations, more politics, less immediacy, the kind of place where wars were planned in climate-controlled rooms by people w'ho'd forgotten what cordite smelled like. But the brief mattered. The mission we designed would set the template for future maritime interdiction operations across the Pacific Theater. If we got it right, we'd save lives and eliminate a piracy network that had been operating with impunity for 5 years. If we got it wrong, we'd waste resources and embolden adversaries. I spent 40 hours rehearsing my section, 12 minutes of aviation warfare analysis covering insertion timing, extraction protocols, and emergency contingency planning. Porter watched my third run-through and said, "You're over-preparing. You know this material better than anyone in that room will. Trust yourself." "I'm briefing the Joint Chiefs, sir. 4-star generals and admirals who've forgotten more about warfare than I'll ever know." "Wrong," Porter said. "They've forgotten more about the wars they fought. You're the expert on the war we're about to fight. Big difference." The morning of the brief, I wore my service dress with every ribbon I'd earned. The Purple Hearts sat in the second row, for small rectangles of purple and bronze that told a story I didn't need to explain. When I checked my reflection in the bathroom mirror, I saw a lieutenant colonel who'd earned her place through blood and confidence. No apologies. No self-doubt. The briefing room was exactly what I'd expected. Dark wood paneling, leather chairs, the seal of the Joint Chiefs mounted on the wall behind a massive conference table. The chiefs filed in at 0855, chairman, vice chairman, and the service chiefs for Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and Space Force. Combined, they represented over 2 centuries of military experience and authority that could reshape entire theaters of operation with a single decision. Colonel Porter opened with the strategic overview, explaining why the piracy network mattered and how our proposed operation would dismantle it. He was polished, confident, exactly the kind of brief that senior leaders appreciated: clear problem, clear solution, clear metrics for success. Then he introduced me. The aviation warfare analysis will be presented by Lieutenant Colonel Ariana Hale, our primary Joint Air Operations Advisor. I stood and walked to the front of the room. The chief's eyes tracked me, assessing, calculating, deciding whether I was worth their attention. I'd been in enough high-stakes briefings to recognize the test: prove you belong in the next 30 seconds or lose them forever. I clicked to my first slide, a timeline showing insertion and extraction windows synchronized with tidal patterns, moonlight, and enemy shift changes. "Gentlemen, the success of this operation depends on aviation precision measured in minutes, not hours." I walked them through the analysis, explaining how helicopter assault timing synchronized with naval gunfire support, how emergency divert protocols accounted for mechanical failures or unexpected enemy resistance, how we'd positioned aerial refueling assets to extend operational range without compromising response time. I spoke for 11 minutes and 43 seconds. Nobody interrupted. When I finished, the chairman, a 4-star Army general with 40 years in service, leaned forward. "Colonel, your contingency planning assumes we lose the primary extraction helo. What's your confidence level that the backup protocols actually work under combat stress?" "We've rehearsed them 12 times, sir, including 3 full-scale exercises with live assets. Success rate is 100%. The key variable is communication timing. If the ground commander delays his abort call by more than 90 seconds, we lose our window. But we've trained that scenario specifically, and the current team executes it consistently." He nodded. "And if we lose both extraction helos?" I'd prepared for this question. "Then we execute CSR Protocol Echo 7, redirect the combat search and rescue bird from the offshore destroyer, extend the ground team's hold position by 15 minutes, and bring in the backup refueling tanker to extend the SR bird's operational range. It's a higher-risk option, but it's viable." The Air Force chief spoke up. "You've coordinated this across 4 service branches. What's your biggest inter-service friction point?" "Communication protocols, sir. Navy and Marine terminology for helicopter operations differs slightly from Air Force standards. We've created a common lexicon for this mission, but it requires constant reinforcement during training. The risk isn't catastrophic failure, it's small miscommunications that cascade into timing errors." He smiled slightly. "You just described every joint operation I've ever run. How are you mitigating it?" "Embedded liaisons at every command level, sir. We've got Air Force combat controllers with the SEAL teams, Navy Air coordinators with the Marine ground element, and real-time communication monitoring from the command center. If someone uses non-standard terminology, we catch it and correct it immediately. The brief continued for another 40 minutes, with Porter handling the ground assault piece and a Navy captain covering the maritime interdiction. But the questions kept coming back to aviation. The chiefs understood that the entire operation depended on helicopters arriving exactly when needed and leaving before enemy reinforcements could respond. When we finished, the chairman stood. "This is solid work. Approved for execution, pending final operational security review." He looked at me. "Colonel Hale, that was one of the better aviation briefs I've seen. Clear, realistic, and you obviously know your material. Well done." "Thank you, sir." The chiefs filed out and the room exhaled. Porter turned to me and grinned. "You just briefed the Joint Chiefs and they approved your plan. How does that feel?" "Surreal," I admitted. "Get used to it. This is what O5 looks like when you're actually good at your job." We flew back to Norfolk that afternoon. When I walked into the planning cell the next morning, several officers congratulated me. Word had spread that the brief had gone well. Admiral Maddox was in his office, door closed, working through the operational security review. I didn't see him until that afternoon, when he emerged for a logistics coordination meeting. He looked at me once, held my gaze for a moment, then looked away. No congratulations. No acknowledgement. Just the same professional distance he'd maintained for weeks. I realized I didn't care. I didn't need his approval anymore. The Joint Chiefs had validated my work. Colonel Porter had trusted me with a career-defining brief. I'd proven myself to people who actually mattered. That evening, I got a message from Major General Sienna Ward, an Air Force 08 who'd been a mentor during my early years as a captain. She'd heard about the Joint Chiefs brief through back channels. The message read, "Heard you killed it at the Pentagon. Proud of you. Also heard you put a certain SEAL Admiral in his place a few weeks ago. Even prouder of that. Call me when you have time." I called her that night. She answered on the second ring. "Ariana, tell me everything." So I did. I told her about the briefing room confrontation, about the Purple Hearts on the table, about the weeks of navigating fallout and holding boundaries. I told her about Maddox's guilt trip, about the IG inquiry, about the slow shift in how people treated me. When I finished, General Ward was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know what you just described? Leadership. Real leadership, not the bullshit they teach in officer development school. You set a standard, you held it even when it cost you, and you forced everyone around you to rise to it. That's what OSIXS and above are supposed to do. I'm not 06 yet, ma'am. You will be. And when you are, remember this moment. Remember that respect isn't given, it's demanded through competence and boundaries. You're going to mentor junior officers someday, and they're going to need to hear this story." We talked for another hour about career progression, about the politics of flag rank, about what it meant to be a woman in joint operations where most of the senior leaders were men who'd never had to fight for respect the way we did. When I hung up, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: certainty. Certainty that I'd made the right call. Certainty that I belonged at this level. Certainty that the 16 years I'd spent clawing my way through deployments and injuries and disrespect had been worth it. I wasn't the rookie anymore. I never had been. And everyone who mattered finally knew it. The operation launched 6 weeks later on a moonless night in the South China Sea. I coordinated the aviation piece from the command center aboard the USS Michael Monsoor, a guided missile destroyer positioned 30 nautical miles offshore. The command center was cramped, filled with monitors showing live feeds from helicopter cockpits, drone overwatch, and satellite imagery. Admiral Maddox commanded the overall operation from the adjacent compartment, his voice calm over the radio net as he managed the moving pieces. I wore a headset and monitored 6 different communication channels simultaneously: SEAL Team Leader, Marine Ground Element, Helicopter Pilots, Aerial Refueling Tanker, Combat Search and Rescue Standby, and the destroyer's Tactical Operations Center. My job was to ensure that every aircraft arrived exactly when needed and departed before enemy forces could organize a response. The insertion went perfectly. For helicopters delivered 60 operators to the target compound at 0230 hours, synchronized with a naval gunfire support mission that suppressed enemy communications. The SEAL teams and Marine Force recon elements cleared the compound in 18 minutes, capturing 3 high-value targets and securing intelligence materials that would dismantle the piracy network's financial infrastructure. Then the enemy reinforcements arrived earlier than expected. All aircraft, this is Ground 1, the SEAL team leader's voice came over the net, tight with controlled urgency. We've got technical vehicles inbound from the northwest, ETA 4 minutes. Request immediate extraction. I pulled up the helicopter positions on my monitor. The extraction birds were 3 minutes out, which meant a 60-second gap between when the enemy arrived and when we could pull our people out. 60 seconds of exposure, of potential casualties, of everything going wrong. Ground 1, Air Boss, I said, using my call sign. Extraction birds are 3 minutes out. Can you hold position? Negative, Air Boss. We're taking fire from the tree line. We need those birds now. I ran the numbers in my head. The backup extraction protocol we'd rehearsed assumed mechanical failure, not early enemy contact. But the principle was the same: redirect available assets and compress the timeline. Stand by, Ground 1. I switched channels. Overwatch 2, Air Boss. What's your fuel state? The drone pilot responded immediately. Air Boss, Overwatch 2. We've got 18 minutes of station time remaining. Not enough. I needed something faster, closer, with the ability to suppress enemy fire. I looked at the tactical display and found it. The combat search and rescue helicopter positioned on the destroyer's deck, rotors already spinning, crew ready for emergency launch. SAR-1 Air Boss. I need you airborne in 90 seconds, proceeding to Lima Zulu 27 for immediate fire support and emergency extraction. How copy? Air Boss, SAR-1. Good copy, we're launching now. The SAR bird lifted off the deck 30 seconds later, its door gunners already preparing weapons. I redirected the primary extraction birds to orbit south of the target while SAR-1 made the high-speed run to the landing zone. The timeline compressed. SAR-1 arrived 45 seconds before the enemy vehicles, its door gunners laying down suppressive fire that forced the technicals to slow and take cover. Ground 1, Air Boss. SAR-1 is on station. You've got a 30-second window for emergency extract, priority personnel only. Primary extraction birds will land 60 seconds later for remaining personnel and equipment. Air Boss, Ground 1. Understood. Marking LZ now. The extraction happened in phases. SAR-1 took the 3 high-value targets and 4 wounded operators, lifting off under fire and climbing fast. The primary extraction birds landed 30 seconds later, loading the remaining personnel while SAR-1's door gunners provided overhead cover. Total time on ground, 90 seconds. 0 friendly casualties. When the last helicopter cleared the coast and headed for the carrier, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Admiral Maddox's voice came over the command net. Air Boss, well done. That redirect saved the mission. Thank you, sir. The operators returned to the ship at 0400 hours, exhausted, adrenaline still high. I stayed in the command center until every aircraft was accounted for, every fuel state verified, every systems check completed. When I finally pulled off my headset at 0530, my hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the crash after hours of sustained focus. Colonel Porter found me in the ship's galley 20 minutes later, drinking coffee that tasted like battery acid. He sat down across from me. The SEAL team leader told me what you did out there, he said. Redirecting the SAR bird while the enemy was inbound, that was ballsy. It was the only option that kept the timeline intact, sir. Maybe. But most people would have stuck with the rehearsed plan and hoped the ground team could hold longer. You adapted in real time and made it work. He paused. That's why I'm recommending you for a Bronze Star with Valor device. I looked up sharply. Sir, I was in a command center. I didn't take fire. You made decisions under combat stress that directly saved lives. That's what the Valor device recognizes. He stood. Get some sleep, Colonel. You've earned it. I went back to my stateroom but couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the extraction sequence, identifying places where I could have been faster, clearer, more decisive. It was an old habit, the constant self-assessment that turned every mission into a lesson. My phone buzzed with a message from Chief Red, who was back at Norfolk. Heard the op went well, and you pulled off some aviation magic. Proud of you. Also heard Maddox actually said thank you. Mark your calendar. That's a historic moment. I smiled despite the exhaustion. Then I pulled up the mission timeline and started documenting lessons learned for the after-action review. There would be time for sleep later. Right now, the work mattered more. The after-action review happened 72 hours after we returned to Norfolk. 50 officers packed into the operations center, reviewing every phase of the mission, planning, rehearsals, execution, and extraction. When we reached the emergency redirect sequence, Admiral Maddox paused the playback. The decision to launch SAR-1 for fire support and emergency extraction was not part of the rehearsed plan, he said. Colonel Hale made that call in real time based on changing battlefield conditions. It worked. But I want to examine why it worked, so we can replicate it in future operations. I walked them through the decision tree, available assets, fuel states, time compression, risk assessment. The SEAL team leader, a Navy commander with 20 years in special operations, spoke up. Sir, from the ground perspective, that redirect saved lives. We were taking heavy fire, and having SAR-1 overhead with door gunners bought us the time we needed. Colonel Hale's call was exactly right. Several other officers echoed the assessment. When the review concluded, the mission was classified as a decisive success with lessons learned that would inform doctrine for years. Afterward, I was collecting my notes when Admiral Maddox approached. We were alone in the operations center, the other officers having filtered out to grab lunch. Colonel Hale, he said. A moment. I straightened. Sir. He looked uncomfortable, a man unaccustomed to whatever he was about to say. I wanted to acknowledge that your performance during this operation was exceptional. The Joint Chiefs Brief, the mission planning, the real-time aviation coordination, you've set a standard that others will struggle to match. Thank you, sir. He hesitated, then continued. I also wanted to say that I've reflected on what happened in the first briefing. My comment was inappropriate. You didn't deserve that. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was close. I met his eyes and saw something there I hadn't seen before, genuine discomfort, maybe even regret. I appreciate that, sir, I said carefully. I've spent my career in the SEAL community, he said. It's insular. We look after our own, sometimes at the expense of recognizing talent in other services. That's a failure of leadership on my part. He paused. You've proven yourself repeatedly, and I should have acknowledged that years ago. The words hung in the air. Part of me wanted to accept them at face value, to believe that this represented real change. Another part, the part that had spent 16 years watching him take credit for my work, remained skeptical. Sir, I don't need retroactive acknowledgement, I said. I need professional respect going forward. That's all. You have it, he said. And for what it's worth, I'll be recommending you for 06 when your promotion board convenes next year. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded. He left without another word. Chief Red found me later that afternoon, sitting in the empty briefing room, staring at nothing. You look like someone who just had a weird conversation, he said. Maddox apologized. Sort of. Marcus raised his eyebrows. Huh. Character growth or damage control? I don't know. Maybe both. I rubbed my face. Part of me wants to believe he means it. The other part remembers 16 years of him treating me like a useful junior who'd never quite measure up. What does your gut say? I thought about it. That he's scared. The IG inquiry is still open, his reputation took a hit, and he's realized that being dismissive has consequences. So he's adapting. Whether that adaptation is genuine or just self-preservation. I shrugged. Does it matter? Marcus asked. You've already won. You set the boundary, you held it, and now he's treating you with respect because he has to, not because he wants to. That's accountability. It doesn't feel like winning. That's because winning isn't supposed to feel good. It's supposed to feel like work. He sat down next to me. You know what comes next, right? What? You move on. You stop thinking about him and start thinking about what you want the next 5 years of your career to look like. Because you're about to be in the O6 zone, which means you'll have real authority to shape how joint operations actually work. That's the opportunity. He was right. I'd spent so much energy managing the Maddox situation that I'd lost sight of the bigger picture. I was a lieutenant colonel with a combat record that spoke for itself, a Bronze Star with Valor device pending, and credibility across 4 service branches. The question wasn't whether I could survive Admiral Maddox's disrespect. The question was what I was going to build now that I'd proven I didn't need his validation. That night, I pulled out a notebook and started outlining what I wanted the next phase of my career to look like. Not reactive. Not defensive. Proactive. I wanted to mentor younger officers the way I'd never been mentored, with genuine investment, without extracting credit for their successes. I wanted to push for better inter-service communication protocols, the kind that prevented small misunderstandings from cascading into mission failures. I wanted to be the officer who made joint operations work, not because it advanced my career, but because it saved lives. I wrote for 2 hours, filling pages with ideas, frameworks, lessons I'd learned the hard way. When I finally put the pen down, I felt something shift, a reorientation from defense to offense, from survival to purpose. The next morning, I requested a meeting with Major General Sienna Ward to discuss long-term career planning. She agreed immediately. We met 2 weeks later at her office in the Pentagon, and I laid out what I wanted to accomplish over the next 5 years. She listened without interrupting, then said, "You're describing the career trajectory of someone who's going to make O7. You know that, right?" "I'm not thinking about stars, ma'am. I'm thinking about impact." "That's exactly why you'll get them," she said. "Impact at your level is how you earn flag rank. Keep doing what you're doing. Set standards, hold boundaries, and refuse to tolerate mediocrity. The rest will follow." I left that meeting with clarity I hadn't felt in years. The Maddox situation had been necessary, painful, but necessary. It had forced me to stop minimizing my own competence and start demanding the respect I'd earned. But it was also over. He was no longer the defining relationship in my career. I was. A year later, I stood in a small conference room at Joint Base Andrews, reviewing my promotion packet for O6. The board would convene in 6 weeks, and my file was as strong as I could make it. Joint Operations Planning Credentials, Bronze Star with Valor, for Purple Hearts, evaluations from senior officers across all service branches calling me the finest aviation warfare officer of her generation. Admiral Maddox's recommendation letter was included in the packet. I'd read it once, clinically assessing its content. It was professional, accurate, and lukewarm. He praised my technical competence and operational success, but stopped short of the effusive language that marked truly competitive candidates. It was the recommendation of someone fulfilling an obligation, not championing a protege. I filed it with the others and didn't think about it again. The promotion board results came out in April. I made the list. Lieutenant Colonel Ariana Hale, selected for promotion to colonel, pending Senate confirmation. The notification arrived via email at 1300 hours on a Tuesday, and I stared at it for a long moment before allowing myself to feel anything. Then I called my mother. She'd retired from the Air Force 3 years earlier after 32 years as an enlisted maintainer, and she understood what this meant in ways most people couldn't. "You made O6, she said when I told her. Not a question. A statement of fact. I did. Good. You earned it." Her voice was matter-of-fact, the way it always was, but I could hear the pride underneath. "What's next?" "I don't know yet. I've got a few assignment options. Joint staff, numbered Air Force staff, maybe a wing command if I'm lucky. You'll figure it out. You always do." We talked for another 20 minutes about family, about her garden, about whether I'd come visit during summer leave. When we hung up, I sat in the quiet of my office and let the moment settle. I'd made colonel. I'd risen from second lieutenant to O6 over the course of 20 years, through deployments that aged me and injuries that marked me and decisions that defined me. I'd earned 4 Purple Hearts, a Bronze Star, and the respect of officers who'd initially dismissed me as too junior, too inexperienced, too female to handle joint operations pressure. And I'd done it while refusing to tolerate disrespect from a mentor who'd once held power over my career. The promotion ceremony happened 3 months later on a bright July morning at Balling Air Force Base. My mother pinned on my new rank insignia, silver eagles that felt heavier than they looked, while Chief Red stood next to her, grinning like a proud uncle. Colonel Porter flew in from Quantico to attend, and Major General Ward delivered remarks praising my uncommon competence and unwavering professional standards. Admiral Maddox sent a congratulatory email. I read it, acknowledged it with a polite thank you, and filed it away. After the ceremony, I hosted a small reception at the Officers' Club. Porter pulled me aside near the end of the evening, bourbon in hand. "You know you're one of the youngest OSIXS in the joint community, right?" he said. "I hadn't thought about it, sir." "Well, think about it now. You've got 15, maybe 20 years left before mandatory retirement. That's enough time to make serious changes in how joint operations actually work. Don't waste it playing politics." "I don't intend to, sir." "Good. Because people like you, people who've actually bled for this, are the only ones who can fix the broken parts. The careerists can't do it. They're too invested in the system as it is." I thought about that later, standing on the club's patio, watching the sun set over the Potomac. I'd spent 2 decades learning how to survive in a system that rewarded conformity and punished dissent. I'd earned my place through competence and sacrifice. And now I had the rank and credibility to actually change things. The question was whether I had the courage to use it. My first assignment as a colonel was to the Joint Staff J3 at the Pentagon, working in the Operations Directorate with responsibility for cross-theater aviation coordination. It was a desk job, mostly, but it put me in rooms where decisions were made about how future conflicts would be fought. I spent 2 years there, quietly pushing for better inter-service communication protocols, advocating for realistic training standards, and mentoring junior officers who reminded me of myself at 25, competent, hungry, and constantly underestimated. One of those officers was a first lieutenant named Maya Chin, an Air Force pilot with 3 combat deployments and a tendency to speak her mind in ways that made senior officers uncomfortable. She reminded me of myself before I'd learned to navigate military politics, back when I'd thought competence alone would be enough. I pulled her aside after a briefing where she'd corrected a Navy captain's flawed assumption about helicopter performance envelopes. "You were right in there," I said. "But you made him look stupid in front of his peers. That's going to cost you." "Ma'am, he was wrong. Someone needed to say it." "Agreed. But there's a way to correct people that preserves their dignity while still getting the facts on the table. Watch." I spent 30 minutes teaching her the art of professional disagreement, how to frame corrections as collaborative problem-solving, how to acknowledge partial truth before introducing better data, how to let senior officers save face while still holding the line on accuracy. It was the mentorship I'd never received, delivered to someone who needed it the way I once had. A month later, she applied the technique in a joint planning session and managed to redirect a flawed operational concept without alienating the Navy commander who'd proposed it. Afterward, she thanked me. "That's what OSIXS are supposed to do," I told her. "Teach people how to be effective without destroying themselves in the process." I mentored a dozen officers like her over the next 2 years, building a quiet reputation as someone who invested in junior talent without extracting credit. Word spread. Young officers started requesting assignments to my section. Senior officers started asking me to recommend candidates for key positions. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the culture began to shift. Not dramatically, not universally, but in small ways that mattered: better communication, less territorialism, more willingness to acknowledge when other services had better solutions. 3 years after my promotion to colonel, I received a phone call from the Air Force Personnel Center. They were offering me command of a wing at Joint Base Charleston, operational control of 60 aircraft, 2,000 personnel, and responsibility for global mobility operations that moved everything from humanitarian aid to special operations forces. Wing command was the assignment that determined whether you'd ever make general officer. It was also the hardest job in the Air Force: 18-hour days, constant pressure, decisions that affected thousands of lives. I could decline and stay at the Pentagon, building policy and mentoring officers in the relative safety of staff work. Or I could take the command and prove I could lead at scale. I accepted the command. The change of command ceremony happened on a cold morning in November. As I stood on the parade ground, watching 2,000 airmen standing in formation, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. From second lieutenant to colonel. From the officer who'd needed Admiral Maddox's validation to the officer who set her own standards. From the rookie to the commander. During my speech, I kept it simple. This wing's mission is to move people and cargo to wherever they're needed, whenever they're needed, regardless of conditions. That mission succeeds when every airman, from crew chiefs to pilots to logisticians, knows their work matters and their competence is respected. That's the standard. Hold each other to it. After the ceremony, I walked through the maintenance hangars, talking to airmen who reminded me of my mother, enlisted experts who knew their aircraft better than anyone and deserved to be treated like the professionals they were. I shook hands with pilots who'd flown combat missions over hostile territory. I met with logisticians who kept supply chains functioning across 6 continents. And I realized that this, leading people who did difficult work with quiet competence, was what I'd been training for since I was 16 years old and flew my first Civil Air Patrol mission. The command lasted 2 years. We deployed aircraft to support 3 different contingency operations, flew humanitarian missions after natural disasters in Southeast Asia and the Caribbean, and maintained a readiness rate that exceeded Air Force standards. My evaluations called the performance exceptional and a model for wing-level leadership. More importantly, I mentored 17 junior officers who went on to command positions of their own. I taught them what I'd learned the hard way, that respect is earned through competence and maintained through boundaries. That you can be demanding without being cruel. That the mission matters more than your ego. Near the end of my command tour, I received word that Admiral Cole Maddox had retired. He'd made 3 stars before his career plateaued, solid, respectable, but not the 4-star legacy he'd probably envisioned. I read the announcement in the Navy Times and felt nothing. No satisfaction. No vindication. Just the quiet recognition that our paths had diverged years ago, and whatever bond had once existed between us was long since irrelevant. A week later, I received my own notification. I'd been selected for Brigadier General, pending Senate confirmation. 1 star. The flag rank that separated senior officers from strategic leaders. I called my mother first. Then Chief Red, who was now the Command Chief Master Sergeant at a major command and still one of my closest friends. Then Colonel Porter, who'd retired to Montana and spent his days fly fishing and writing memoir. I told you this would happen, Porter said when I shared the news. You set standards and refuse to compromise them. That's what earns stars. It doesn't feel like I did anything special, I admitted. I just did the work. That's exactly what makes you special, he said. Most people chase recognition. You chased competence. The recognition followed because it had to. The promotion ceremony happened 6 months later. Major General Sienna Ward pinned on my single star while my mother stood beside her, 72 years old and still capable of making me feel like the kid who'd joined Civil Air Patrol with more ambition than sense. In my speech, I talked about the people who'd shaped my career, the enlisted maintainers like my mother who taught me that competence mattered more than rank, the junior officers who reminded me why mentorship mattered, the senior leaders who'd invested in me without expecting repayment. I didn't mention Admiral Maddox. He was part of the story, but not the story. The story was about learning that you couldn't build a career on someone else's validation. You had to earn your own. Afterward, at the reception, a young captain approached me, an Air Force officer with 2 deployments and a Bronze Star who looked nervous about speaking to a 1-star general. "Ma'am," she said, "I heard about what happened with you and that SEAL Admiral years ago." The purple hearts on the table. I wanted to thank you. I raised an eyebrow. Thank me for what? For showing people like me that we don't have to tolerate disrespect just because someone outranks us. That we can hold the line without destroying our careers. She paused. It matters. I looked at her, 20-something, competent, hungry to prove herself in a profession that would test her in ways she couldn't yet imagine. And I saw myself at that age, desperate for someone to tell me that survival was possible, that I could be both competent and respected, that I didn't have to choose between my integrity and my career. You're going to face people who underestimate you, I told her. Who dismiss you because you're young, or female, or from the wrong service branch. When that happens, remember that their disrespect says more about them than it does about you. Do the work. Earn your place. And don't let anyone convince you that you haven't. She nodded, eyes bright. Yes, ma'am. She walked away, and I watched her go, thinking about all the young officers who'd face the same challenges I had. Some would survive. Some wouldn't. But maybe, just maybe, the standards I'd set and the boundaries I'd held would make the path a little less brutal for the ones who came after. That, more than the star on my shoulder, felt like legacy. That's how it unfolded, a room full of officers, one admiral with too much confidence, and a moment that finally put everything in perspective. Now I'm curious. Have you ever had someone underestimate you until you showed them who you really were? How did you handle it? Drop your story in the comments, I read all of them. If this hit home, tap like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs a reminder of their own strength. And let me know, what would you have done in my place? Have you ever had to put someone back in their place professionally, calmly, but decisively?